Hello, dear students. So as we continue through Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity in Chapter 3, I've got a presentation here on sections 3 and 4 for this week, where we turn from a consideration of the oppressor, and in particular the way that the oppressor uses the past. We continue with more temporal discussion, looking especially at how the oppressor uses the present and the future, and how these are contrasted with a moral approach to the present and the future, i.e. the way that Beauvoir argues it, an existentialist approach. So this presentation will be structured such that I'll work through the reading questions for this week. So then you will be able to check your own critical reading to see that you are finding the relevant passages and having some understanding that will help you to prepare your quiz questions for this. So the first reading question is, what is the paradox of action? So this comes very early in this section. If you look at page 107, if you are reading the same edition that we had put in the syllabus, we get this key quotation. Thus one finds himself in the presence of the paradox that no action can be generated for man without its being immediately generated against men. And that's probably important, at least poetically, the way that Beauvoir puts this, right? Generated for man, for humankind, without its being immediately generated against men, particular people against whom one fights. So Beauvoir has argued that in the face of oppression, there is a good existentialist reason, the interconnectedness, the intersubjectivity, the fact that to will oneself free is also to will others free, means that I actually do have duties to support the freedom of others. But there's a paradox to this, because of course in order to oppose someone like the oppressor or those who help the oppressor, then you are using your freedom in support of the freedom of some people only by pitting your use of freedom against that of the oppressor and those who support the oppressor. Right? So think about what a freedom fighter does. Part of the paradox here is that freedom for the sake of freedom comes into conflict with freedom, but part of the ambiguity is in the subjectivity-objectivity sort of pair. So to fight with another is to experience them as an object, and this comes right after this on 107 and continuing this discussion. Right? If you're literally fighting with someone, then they have to be a physical thing, and what can collide with an object? It has to be another object. And so there's a way in which I have to make myself an object in order to pursue this freedom that arises from a subjective sort of wellspring. So fighting for my freedom, or fighting for freedom in general, universally, can bring me into conflict with particular people, right, and their use of freedom in such a way that everything's just reduced to objectivity. And Beauvoir's point here is that it's paradoxical. That's one thing, that there is a paradox. And then she notes that most systems of ethics, of course, most sort of governments or authority structures will not admit this, right? So they want everything to be victorious, right? So everyone loves a victory parade. No one wants to deal with the sorts of tragedies that go into any sort of really large-scale fighting. No one wants to look at what our bombs do to someone else, right? But Beauvoir says it's a paradox that you have to actually look at and in a way affirm, right? To say that, look, even though it is this way that you would think you would try to avoid, it might in fact be morally obligatory in this existentialist sort of way. So paradox comes up again. The second reading question is, in what way is heroism paradoxical? And the key quotation here comes on pages 115 and 116, still in section 3 of chapter 3. And I've got a long quotation that I've pulled up here because I think it's worth looking through all of this. Freedom demands both that it recover itself as an absolute and that it prolong its movement indefinitely. It is through this indefinite movement that it desires to come back to itself and to confirm itself. Now, death puts an end to his drive. The hero can transcend death toward a future fulfillment, but he will not be present in that future. This must be understood if one wishes to restore to heroism its true worth. It is neither natural nor easy. The hero may overcome his regret and carry out his sacrifice. The latter is nonetheless an absolute renunciation. There's a sense in which the hero is not victorious, right? The hero makes a sacrifice, and if we're going to consider that sacrifice as a real sacrifice, then the hero is doing something that is, in a sense, paradoxical, right? In order to open up the future, in order to make a future for others, the hero lays down their own future, right? The hero who makes the sort of the ultimate sacrifice, if you want to put it in that sense. This is somewhat paradoxical, right? Because if you're thinking about freedom in general, then the hero is using their freedom in particular to support freedom in general in a way that puts an end to their freedom in particular. And so I think I hope this is a helpful explanation. So freedom seeks an open future, and by open future I mean something that's not yet determined, something that has not yet decided possibilities, right? The idea that I can really choose and make a difference, or at least attempt to make a difference to the future. If that's true, then the hero uses their freedom to ensure such an open future for others, but only by closing off their own future in death. And so keep in mind the context here, right, that we're talking about oppression and the way that the oppressor will misuse these actually really important values in order to suppress value and meaning for the people that they oppress. Right, so it's no good to throw around the word sacrifice for propaganda. If you have to think about sacrifice as a real sacrifice, then there's something paradoxical about that. It doesn't mean that it's not to be chosen, and it doesn't mean that the hero is not a hero. It means that the only way the hero can be a hero is in the midst of a very deep paradox. And so paradox and ambiguity are really closely connected here. The next reading question asks, why must authoritarians attempt to suppress freedom of thought? How does authoritarianism depend on this? The key quotation comes on page 118. There's really this whole thing right before this. Beauvoir mentions anguish, so you might want to give yourself a little refresher on start there. But there's this whole discussion from really the latter half of 117 is where this paragraph starts, and the same paragraph continues through to page 119. So it's a long paragraph. Beauvoir tended to write that way. And here's the quotation. And if the soldier's eyes open, he too asks, who is he, whoever the authority is, to command me? Instead of a prophet, he sees nothing more than a tyrant. That is why every authoritarian party considers thought as a danger and reflection as a crime. It is by means of thought that crime appears as such in the world. There's a kind of reflection and awareness that takes place in order to understand when rulers, authorities are doing something wrong. And so the first way to keep people from realizing that wrong is to just try to suppress free thought in general. So there are always uncertainties. And again, Beauvoir is talking about this in relation to the anguish of an ethical leader. So there are always uncertainties. So any leader acting in good faith, any leader who is really trying to make a moral use of their freedom does so in anguish, right? They ask the question, well, what if everyone did as I did? They ask questions like, who am I to make this decision on behalf of others? And again, that example from Sartre, when Sartre is trying to explain anguish, there's the example of Abraham, and then there's the example specifically of some sort of leader in military battle who sends the troops into battle, right? And that person, if they're doing their job right, is making that decision in anguish because they realize that they could be wrong. They realize that it could turn out badly. and they know that they are making a decision on behalf of others, that's kind of a terrible and uncertain decision. And so there's this idea of anguish that goes into that. So any decision is questionable, right? You can't know ahead of time that this is good or right to do. So the first thing that leaders acting in bad faith usually do is just to try to get rid of all questions in general. So if you get rid of all questions in general, then no one realizes that the leader's actions are questionable. And there's this other quotation that comes on page 119 as Beauvoir is continuing this discussion. In order to mask the violence of these kinds of decisions being made, of what's being commanded of people, what they do is to have recourse to a new violence, which even invades his mind. So then moving into section 4 of chapter 3, the title for this section is the present and the future. So we're moving from the paradox of action, or the antinomies of action, to the present and the future. And Beauvoir says there are two meanings of future. So the reading question asks, well, what are those two meanings? And you need to be able to explain the meaning of those meanings of future in terms of the relationship of future to the present. This is the kind of big picture of what's going on in subsection 4 of chapter 4. So another long quote right at the beginning of the section here. The word future has two meanings corresponding to the two aspects of the ambiguous condition of man. So here's where we're going to get a little bit more of an idea of what Beauvoir means by ambiguity. The ambiguous condition of man, which is lack of being and which is existence. So those would be literally speaking the two meanings. So lack of being and existence. It alludes to both being, right, what something is, and existence, that something is, or how something is probably better in terms of existentialism. The future is the definite direction of a particular transcendence. Right? It's the things that we do and that we are working towards. And it is so closely bound up with the present that it composes with it a single temporal form. But through the centuries, men have dreamed of another future in which it might be granted them to retrieve themselves as beings in glory, happiness, or justice. And capital letters are important here. These sort of big picture ideals. This future did not prolong the present. It came down upon the world like a cataclysm announced by signs which cut the continuity of time. I think this is really key for understanding what Beauvoir is doing here. There's the future as something open, something that we're creating through our actions in the present, right? The idea of the future being what we're working towards, right? This thing that's coming, but it's only coming as a result of what I'm doing right now, right? It's the result of my choices. There's that sense of future, and then there's the future, this sort of thing, this heavenly state, this perfect state, this grand and glorious ideal that will be achieved by the God, the Messiah, the revolution, the party, depending on if you take a more sort of religious or political approach to this. Right, so again, we've sort of talked about some of the parallels between Christianity and Marxism from an existentialist perspective, the ways that they're the same. And so in one sense, this sort of religious perspective and this sort of Marxist perspective end up being the same, right? There's our group or thing that we put our trust in will bring about the glorious future, and that glorious future is this certain and determined and determinate thing. And in comparison with that, right, in comparison with heaven, in comparison with the perfect socialist state, nothing else matters. That's what they say, right? Those sort of authoritarians. So Beauvoir notes that these two meanings of the future have been fused in the modern idea of progress. So you get these two meanings of future, but then you really get a third one on page 125, that there's this kind of sense of progress as being working towards this future, but that future's not open, that future's not something that we get to decide. It's this future that's already been decided for us, and then we're supposed to somehow fall in line in order to bring it about. So then the final reading question asks, how does the double meaning of end help to explain the meaning of ambiguity? So as you're trying to understand ambiguity, this is something that we get again and again throughout the book, right? So it's really something that you don't understand on the first page or at the end of the first chapter. The actual section that's titled Ambiguity comes next, right, with section 5 of chapter 3. And so it's really something you're building up through your work, reading through the entire essay. Key quotation here comes on page 137. As soon as they give the word end, which means like a goal, as soon as they give the word end its double meaning of goal and fulfillment, they clearly perceive this ambiguity of their condition, which is the most fundamental of all. Right? So here's a fundamental ambiguity of human existence, that every living movement is a sliding toward death. And of course, even the jokes about existentialism are always going to highlight the fact that everything comes back to death in some way. But if they are willing to look it in the face, they also discover that every movement toward death is life. So you might think of this as a kind of paradox. It's definitely, Beauvoir says it's a fundamental ambiguity. Think about what happens when you achieve a long-term goal. And for many of you, this may be very much on your mind. You may be graduating soon. You may have other sort of long-term goals in terms of your careers, your education, your family, or just other somewhat smaller projects in comparison with that. But what happens when you actually achieve a long-term goal? All that work you did, this whole thing that's been a part of your life for however long it is, that's taken up so much of your energy and time for however long it was, then it's done, right? You have to start something new. It ends at that point. And so think, what if you give up on the future? You really stop living to do that. If you stop working towards the future, if you're not projecting, working on projects. But at the same time, to live is to move towards death. That's an inevitability that is part of the human condition, that universal human condition that Sartre talked about. So the end, the double meaning being both the goal thing you're working towards and the fact that it's a kind of end point, it's a completion of something, that's both what makes existence possible, and it's what represents the limit of existence. It's what represents the point at which that existence comes to an end. And it's both of those things. It's both of those things at the same time. It's both of those things in the ways that we make choices and the ways that we value our own existence and our use of freedom and the use of freedom of others. And Beauvoir thinks this is fundamental, and she thinks that it's something that, again, ethics or anyone tends to try to hide, tends to try to mask. And so it's really key to think about looking this in the face, right? The ambiguity is to look it in the face, to see it for what it is, and to affirm both the goal and the completion point as both belonging to what it means for me to be.